There's many ways that species interact, and we talked about mutualism and commensalism and parasitism and those specific species interactions. We also need to look at how populations, which are all of one species, looking at how those organisms interact within an ecosystem, and then what happens to their population size in response to various pressures. And so we'll talk about some of those pressures. And one of the pressures is immigration and emigration. So we look at how does population size change, and we obviously change by more critters coming into a system than moving out of it. And so when we look at how they move in, we're looking at they're either born in the system or they come into the system. And then when we look at how do they move out of the system, they move out by either dying or emigrating or moving away from the system. So when we look at that population change, it's the net difference between everybody who's coming in and everybody who's going out. And so if we have 500 coming in and 200 going out, then our population change size is 300. So we're looking at that difference in population size. And that's going to tell us that change in population size can indicate things about the health of an ecosystem. And so that's why ecologists and scientists are concerned about what that net size change is. We look at not just how many organisms are being born, but we also look at how many are leaving due to external pressures or how many are dying because conditions are not right for survival. So we look at age structure, and this is for all organisms. So this is if we're talking about rabbits or coyotes or wolves or people. This part is all the same, no matter what kind of organism we're talking about. So we look at age structure diagrams, and we're going to get into those a little bit more when we actually talk about people, but just so you know that it applies to all critters as well. So we have a pre-reproductive age, and that age is going to vary based on the type of organism. Insects, this pre-reproductive age is really short and it's really young before they get into that reproductive age. For larger organisms, mammals, in particular larger mammals, it takes a lot longer to get to that reproductive age. So when you talk about a mouse versus a kangaroo or an elephant, that time span is a lot different. So this is when they can't reproduce. Reproductive age, obviously they're capable of reproducing. The length of time that lasts, once again, also varies, and a lot of it varies based on the size of the organism. And then we have the post-reproductive age, where they can't reproduce anymore. So we have the two sides where there's no reproduction that's occurring, and then we have the portion where reproduction is occurring. When we look at the speed in which a population grows, we really look toward that pre-reproductive age, because if we have a really large number of critters within that population that are pre-reproductive, then they're all going to move up into that reproductive age if they survive to reproduce again. So it signals that potential for a very large increase in population. If our pre-reproductive age group is smaller than our reproductive age group, then we look at a declining population. And so we can kind of graph these things, and we can look at how is the population health overall, and we can start to make some assumptions based on other data and how is that impacting population size. And then also a little bit of predicting in there as well. So populations can't grow unchecked. In reality, they can grow for a certain amount of time until there's environmental resistance that's going to cause them to stop moving. So the intrinsic rate of increase, and we're going to look at it on a graph here in just a second, would be shown by a fairly vertical line on a graph. So where you're increasing very quickly over a short period of time. And that's how it's going to grow if it had unlimited resources, no external pressures that are causing that population to stop growing. We're talking about there's no predation, there's no lack of food, there's no lack of water, there's no lack of space, all those kinds of things. The carrying capacity, though, is where the population kind of levels out. So carrying capacity doesn't necessarily always mean like it's a straight line. Usually that's how it's shown on a graph, and then populations will kind of hover around that carrying capacity. Every once in a while they'll exceed their carrying capacity, and then they'll dip back down underneath it. So but that carrying capacity is sort of that ceiling for this is how many rabbits an area can sustain. This is how many coyotes an area can sustain. Um, and for organisms other than people in general, if if the organisms overshoot their carrying capacity and where they start to do some environmental damage, that results in less food, water, space, something that they require because they're overusing it, and then they experience a die-off, and so then the ecosystem can kind of right itself again. Human populations are a little bit different in that respect because we manipulate our surroundings to help us to survive. So we don't really fall quite as easily into that graph. So they call them, they give names to the different kinds of curves just to make it a little bit easier to remember, I think, and just because of the way they look. So the exponential part of the graph is the J curve, and that's this portion of the green line right here. So this is showing that intrinsic rate of increase, right? It's showing that we're not limited yet by our resources. We have enough to keep producing and more and more and more until we hit our carrying capacity. And that's where you have the environmental resource. So once again, the environmental resource could be a lack of space, a lack of water, a lack of food. It could be an increase in predators. Generally, the environmental resistance is not a catastrophic event. So it's not like a fire or a hurricane or something like that, because that's generally going to, something like that is generally going to cause a large dip in your population, and then you'll settle out at a new carrying capacity with the new level of resources that are available. So these environmental resistances are more of, here's what we have available in the environment, and we've either, and it's that amount that keeps us from growing a little bit. So it's usually something that's more constant as opposed to a catastrophic event that could happen like once a year or be a one-time event. So once again, here's where this is the S curve part, and they call it an S because it kind of snakes around that carrying capacity. So if you were to look at this one, so this one we're talking about, they've got populations of sheep in here, and I want you to think to yourself, okay, what could be a limiting factor for sheep? What could keep them from growing exponentially, and what could some of that environmental resistance be that's keeping that sheep hovering around that carrying capacity? What could cause an overshoot? What could cause the sheep population in this particular year, so in 1850, what could have caused the sheep population to go up so much? Because that's a lot. We're going up by almost 500,000 sheep in an area. So what kind of things could cause that to happen? Talked about some of that environmental resistance could be the amount of food, the amount of water, and so on. What we didn't talk about is the opposite being true as well. So let's say that in the wintertime, this particular area had a really nice wet winter, and so a lot of grass grew. That could cause an overshoot in the population. You have an increase in the amount of food that's over and above what you would normally have, and so then your adult female population is healthier and can have more babies. You might see more twins occurring at that time, or we're seeing multiple births. Usually the really wet season would have happened like the year before. So if we overshoot the population, it's because the year before that we had that really great year, because we have to take into account gestation and all of that, for how long the organism is going to be pregnant for before they can have their babies. So we have this overshoot. But this was like an anomaly. That kind of wet winter doesn't happen all the time, and so the next year they had a normal winter, and so they didn't have enough food for all these critters that were born, and so that's where your population crashes a little bit and has this decline, because now the population can't be supported by what was something that was out of the ordinary as far as the amount of food was concerned. So When that happens and we have this overshoot, really organisms can do one of three things. They can move, adapt, or die. Now, when we talk about the word adapt, we need to be very careful about what we're talking about with that word, because we use that word in a different way than population ecologists do. When we say, oh, I'm very adaptable, I can change to any situation, what we mean is that I can modify my behavior in order to fit into a new situation. So when we say, oh, I can adapt to the cold, what we really mean is that I can put on a jacket, or I can put on heavier pants and shoes, or I have a heater, or something like that. I haven't adapted at the cellular level. It was not an evolutionary response to natural selection. And that's what the actual term adapt means. When we have an adaptation that occurs, it's because we have organisms that survived where their counterparts died off, and they passed along that trait that was better suited to the environment. So the reindeer here, for example, we'll use him since he's on the screen. The reindeer that had the thicker coat is the one that survived the winter, and so they were the ones that passed along the genes for the thicker coat. And so over time, reindeers developed the thicker coat in order to survive the colder winters. That is an adaptation, and it takes place over multiple generations. An individual reindeer cannot adapt, evolutionarily speaking. They can change their behavior, which is a behavioral modification, which is not the same thing. They can't actually adapt. They were either born with a thicker coat or they weren't. They couldn't develop a thicker coat in response to it being cold. They had the coat that they had. Okay? You have the amount of hair on your arms that you have on your arms. If it was a colder winter, if we had like 5 years of really, really cold winter, you are not going to grow more hair on your arms to help protect you against that cold. It's the same thing with the reindeer. You either have it or you don't. And so adaptation is not really an option. It's not something they can choose to do. It's either they have the genetic makeup to help them survive or not. So I just wanted to be clear on that. They can move, if it's possible, to an area with other resources that will help them to survive. So the reindeer could have moved south, because they're up in the northern hemisphere. So they could have moved south where it was a little bit warmer, and that would be an option for them. That's why migrations happen all the time, is that option to move away from really cold temperatures. And if they can't move, then they die. So this is not a very pleasant example, but when I was still teaching in the classroom, we were doing a lab on little ecosystems, and we made little ecosystems in the cup. We followed the directions in the lab. It was the first year that I'd done this lab, and we were using little guppies, and we had guppies in cups, and we were supposed to have it there for a series of days, and we were measuring the amount of dissolved oxygen that was in the water. Well, we came back one morning, and my kids were like, well, where are the guppies? I'm like, I don't know where the guppies are. And so we looked around, and the guppies had actually jumped out of the cups, unfortunately. It was very sad, and we had a guppy funeral because we were not very happy about the fact that our guppies had jumped out of our cups. But the reality is that the oxygen levels got too low, and so they couldn't adapt to lower amounts of oxygen. They were what they were, right? They were fish, and they had to have the amount of oxygen that they required, and so they chose to move, and unfortunately they moved out of the cup, which was not any better of a situation. So I switched the lab the next year to using betas, because betas have a better resistance. They can tolerate lower amounts of dissolved oxygen, so then we didn't have any fish jumping out of our cups anymore. We also used bigger, we changed our experiments so that we had no more guppy problems, because we did not want to have guppy issues. So this is where we talk about the switching and the moving. This is a behavioral adaptation, when they switch habitats, when they move to a different area, and the migration. And we already talked about the people a little bit. So one of the activities you're going to be doing in this lesson is about density dependent and density independent factors that can influence the size of a population. So density dependent factors are factors that are dependent on how close together and how crowded the population actually is. And so things like diseases are a really big density dependent factor. So the closer we are together, the more likely the disease is to spread. But then there's some that are density independent factors like a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that, where it doesn't matter how close you are together, the hurricane's going to come, whether or not you're there, and it's going to, flood things that are in its way and that kind of thing. It's not going to flood any more or less, depending on how many people are there. Now, some of the things that we have done to the environment, like building levees and that kind of thing, can control or contribute to flooding, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the actual people in the area. So Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans, and it didn't matter if there was 5 people in New Orleans or if there was 50,000 people in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina was going to have the same flooding impact, no matter how many people were there. But when the Black Plague hit Europe, the cities had greater outbreaks of the Black Plague because all the people were really close together, as opposed to the countrysides where people were further apart, and so fewer people died that were further away from the cities. Fewer of them died than the people that were in the cities. One of the other things that population ecologists look at are reproductive patterns. And so, because that's going to tell them how populations will expand, it's a contributing factor too when we look at why are things going on in ecosystems and why are populations responding the way that they are. They also look at their reproductive patterns. So we have some things that make clones. So a good example of that are like polyps and corals and that grow in the ocean. They actually grow little miniatures of themselves and then let them go. So they're actually clones. Grass, a lot of grasses do this too, that have ribosomes and runners, things like that. So when you go to pull up the grass, if you pull up part of it and then there's like the chain of grass, then you pull up another part of it and you pull up a chain of grass. Those are actually little clones of the grass itself. Then there's also sexual reproduction, where we have that genetic material that mixes. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to both. When you look at sexual reproduction, only half of your population is actually giving birth, as opposed to in asexual reproduction, where your entire population is giving birth, and so are making clones of themselves. And so you limit your productivity in sexual reproduction. But that mixing of genetic material, while it has both goods and bads, it really does overall make populations more resilient to change, because you have a larger probability of a genetic variety within your population. You're less likely to get wiped out by disease or something like that, because you have that. When you have that variability, it means that somebody's going to have that better ability to survive and reproduce. So natural selection kind of works in your favor in that case, as opposed to clones, where they're all genetically the same, that if a disease came in, it would wipe out the whole clone, and then it would wipe them all out, because nothing would have that variability to protect themselves. So courtship rituals are kind of a detractor from sexual reproduction, just because they take a lot of energy. It takes a lot. I know it doesn't seem like it, but to grow all those pretty feathers, which sadly girls in the animal world, most of the males are prettier than the girls, because they're showing off for the males, for the females. So putting on this kind of display like the peacock takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy from the animal itself to grow all these. And sometimes the courtship rituals are like the bighorn sheep, where they're butting heads together and stuff like that, and it can cause injury. Population ecologists also look at the reproductive patterns, and a lot of this is dependent on the size and type of organism that they are. So we classify them as either R-selected species or K-selected species, and we're going to go through some characteristics of each of those in just a minute. And we're going to look at these ones just a little bit bigger here. So I want you to think of R-selected species. I want you to think roach. So R-selected is roach. So you think about roaches, sorry, they have lots of offspring. When they give birth, they give lots and lots and lots and lots of babies. But they don't take care of them, so they like lay their eggs and they leave. So they're not protecting anything. They depend on their massive quantity to overcome any loss to predators or cold or heat or anything like that. So they also reach the age of maturity really quickly. Um, so when you think about roaches, their whole lifespan isn't that long. So they continue to reproduce quickly over and over again. Once again, they don't depend on all of their offspring reaching the age, reaching reproductive age. They count on we have enough babies that some of them will get there and then it'll continue along the species. They tend to be smaller in size, which requires less energy. They also tend to be opportunists. They can live in unstable conditions. They tend to be pioneer species. They tend to deal well with instability, and they like to come in and outcompete some of the larger organisms that like to have a more stable climate. So they have a high population growth rate. If you were to think of it as a pyramid where the pre-reproductive age group is at the bottom and the post-reproductive age group is at the top. So your R-selected species are going to have a really wide base. They're going to have a lot of babies, which means that their population growth is going to increase a lot. But, excuse me, that swing, their S-curve around their carrying capacity is going to be really big because they're going to have lots of offspring and then they're going to have lots of die-off. And they're going to have lots of offspring and they're going to have lots of die-off. They don't compete well, but they survive well. As opposed to our K-selected. So I know there's no picture of a kangaroo on here, but think of K-selected as kangaroo. We're talking about like bigger organisms, tend a lot to be mammals, but you could also think of like alligators or some of your larger reptiles in this as well. Some of your smaller like fishes and things like that tend to lean more towards R-selected. K-selected, there are fewer offspring. Think about a kangaroo. Kangaroo will have one, maybe two joeys. They take a lot of care of them. You're a K-selected species. Think of how long your parents took care of you for. Reproductive age tends to be in years as opposed to weeks, like our cockroaches were. They tend to be larger. And K-selected species are not opportunists. We like to have stable climates and stable environments. We tend to be later successional type species, the bigger species. The population growth rate is smaller, so you think of that as opposed to being like a pyramid with a really big base, you're thinking now more rectangular. So you tend to have a more even growth rate, and so that S-curve that hangs around the carrying capacity tends to be a much tighter curve with everything except for people, because we haven't actually gotten to the S-curve part yet for us. We can compete well because of our larger size. So we store more energy in our bodies, and therefore we could make do a little bit longer, like if we ran out of food or something like that. Just a little something to think about. So if we were to experience a significant warming during the century, which would that likely favor, R-selected or K-selected? And I want you to think about that and explain it in your workbook.